Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to TheWrap's Power Women's Summit. This is one of our favorite events of the year. And I'm Diane Haithman, a senior entertainment business writer for TheWrap. And today we are lucky enough to have with us the Women of Lionsgate for an exclusive panel. And the topic today is one that's always on our minds, and that is the brands and franchises in today's media landscape. You know, we have so many wonderful franchises that bring us to the movies, particularly at Christmas to see our favorite shows, and just, the role of what all of that means in Hollywood and how important it is to the development of content and attendance, audiences, all of those things. So we have a really distinguished panel here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each of these women and then ask them to give us a little line on what they do at the studio. First, we have Sandra Stern, who is the newly promoted to vice chairman of the television group. And Sandra, maybe give us a little description of what you're doing in your new post.
We at the television group are very, very busy. We produce primarily scripted shows for broadcast, for cable, for streamers. So we're pretty much all over the board. We are involved in pretty much every aspect of television. We oversee development, production, post-production, distribution. So a lot going on in the TV company. And as I say, we have been pretty much instrumental in opening up many of the new platforms and producing some early content for the new platforms, the emerging platforms, and continue to do so.
Super. Thank you, Sandra. Next, we have Erin Westerman, who is head of production for the Motion Picture Group. Erin, clue us in a little bit on what your days are like.
Yes, I run the creative on the motion picture side. So I have a team of 9 executives who are charged with bringing in scripts, overseeing the development to the point where then we push them into green light, and then manning them internally at the studio and just ensuring that we support the filmmakers to the best of our ability while also making sure that we're delivering to the studio something the studio knows that they can win with, which is something that we owe ourselves as a company, but we also owe the filmmakers at the end, like a win. So I oversee the group that does that.
Great. Thanks, Erin. Jennifer Brown is Executive Vice President and Head of Global Products and Experiences. Tell us what that title means, Jennifer.
Yeah, today's topic is near and dear to my heart because my team is really responsible for taking all of our incredible franchises and top television series and extending them into new opportunities that are off the television screen and off the movie screen. So that's everything from live and location-based entertainment to video games to consumer products and sort of all the new spaces that we're continually pushing into as ways to engage with our fans.
Fantastic. Okay, and last but not least, Kamala Avila Salmon, who is head of inclusive content for the Motion Picture Group.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. So my role in inclusive content was a brand new one when I came in. And the way that I understand it and articulate it is it's my job to partner across the studio to ensure that we build the most diverse and inclusive film slate we can that then translates into commercial content that the audience that consumes it sees themselves in. So it's partnering with Erin and her development team on all the titles that we're working on and thinking through where are those opportunities to make it more inclusive? Where are those opportunities to bring on more underrepresented filmmakers? How can we make it more authentic? How do we avoid tropes and stereotypes? But it's also working with the marketing team to make sure that we're thinking about every title as an inclusive marketing opportunity because our audience is foundationally diverse and inclusive. So really adapting to the shifting marketplace, thinking about underrepresented audiences first and not last, kind of shifting some of the more outdated business modes of thinking to make sure that we're having a fresh approach to the whole content that then the audience experiences as relevant, authentic, and connected to them.
So if it's part of an older franchise, if you will, it's keeping that fresh and moving that into the contemporary world and contemporary landscape.
Yes.
Well, great. Great. Well, let's just kind of jump in with the first question here. With today's media landscape becoming more and more competitive, we've seen the value of the branded IP increase, both from a film and a television perspective. This may have been something that was accelerated by the pandemic. I'm not sure, as we were all changing the way that we were consuming and choosing what we were going to see. What are the factors that have accelerated this shift? I think maybe we'll start with Sandra. I'm sure it's something that all of you have some comment upon.
In the TV landscape, I think we've all seen just an explosion of content, an explosion of platforms, a plethora of choices. It's difficult for consumers to navigate through all of those platforms, all of those shows, all of those programs, even for those of us who live in that world, who make our living in the world of TV.
Mm-hmm.
Brands are comfortable. They bring an audience in, they bring a familiarity. People follow those brands. So we have seen just our latest example, the Continental. It is a prequel, if you will, to the John Wick franchise. Builds on the popularity, the fan base of the John Wick franchise, and essentially brings comfort to Peacock that an audience will find the show, will find Peacock, will come to Peacock because of that show, because of their love of the John Wick franchise. And that's one that's particularly near and dear to us because it is a win-win for both the TV group and the motion picture group. Ideally, it will bring for the motion picture group maybe a new audience or remind the old audience how much they love John Wick, introducing a TV audience to a franchise and a brand that they have loved over the years. Mm-hmm. Same thing with us in TV, with what we call the Powerverse. We had Power on Stars. It was a huge fan favorite. We have now put on Stars Power Book 2 and 3 and 4, each one building on the prior IP. Taking the characters, the world that audiences loved, and keeping them fresh. It is a great benefit to the platform as well because it retains audiences.
Absolutely.
Keeps the audiences coming back for shows that they love.
Sure. Well, Sandra addressed this a little bit when it comes to the motion picture world as well as the television world. But Erin, maybe you can address it a little more specifically as to what these franchises mean in the motion picture world.
I mean, everyone is aware that consumer habits have changed. They were changing in advance of the pandemic just due to the massive, massive amounts of content that are available in the TV space and in the streaming spaces. But then obviously the pandemic affected how consumers make decisions about leaving their house and for what they're willing to leave their house for. And so the bar just gets higher. And the thing that franchises and IP allow for are just a shortcut to awareness and a shortcut to an emotional attachment that the audience may feel worthy of leaving their home for. So it doesn't lower the bar for quality. They're still demanding extraordinary quality. And we have tons of humility about the fact that that thing then needs to stand on its own. But surely there's massive benefit to an audience having a relationship already with the title or the characters.
Absolutely. And this is definitely a question I want all of you to weigh in on. Kamala, what are your thoughts on kind of just the importance of this?
Yeah. I mean, I think just building on what both Sandra and Erin have said, I think that character connection is even more amplified when you're thinking about making inclusive content, because then you have an opportunity to really build a universe that looks like the audience that will consume it. Because franchises take place in and they build universes, they have multiple characters, they have a lot of different locations, there's opportunity to travel sometimes. I think it allows you to build a really authentic and global feel oftentimes in the content that you're making. And when you have a big ensemble, it just gives you a bigger canvas to paint a picture that looks more and more like the world. You're not so limited to 3 characters that are, all related to one another. So once you cast one, you're starting to determine the rest of it. You have that flexibility. And I think in franchise, it's really about thinking about across a cast of characters, how do we put something together that feels authentic and yet has each character living in their own unique backstory that allows different audiences to be able to envision themselves as a part of the crew, which is something that I know we've done really well with even some of our upcoming franchises that we're really proud of.
Yeah, I always think of it, in terms of what the writers must have in their heads, that you need the prequel and the postquel and all of those, the huge world, this huge universe for each franchise is very complicated and very interesting, for sure. Jennifer, I wanted to hear from your perspective about how the franchises play into your work.
So I think it's interesting because you can step outside of film and television for a minute and just think about your own behavior when you're purchasing something. And you tend to gravitate toward products and brands that you trust, right? And that, as was discussed, you have an emotional connection to. And film and television is no different, right? We all have to make choices about the way that we spend our money. And I think, as you mentioned, Diane, obviously the pandemic has had an impact on the way that people are purchasing. So we shifted away from spending money on services, right? And we're spending money on goods and on content because we were home more, right? And then alongside that, as Sandra was discussing earlier, you had this rise in more platforms to distribute content on. So whether, those are streaming platforms, but you also think about podcasts and Web3. And then you think about the economy in general. When we were home during the pandemic, we were choosing to spend our money differently. And so I think franchises and IP, we're seeing the benefit of that. Now, when you have sort of an inflationary trend happening and people are thinking more about how they're spending their money, or at least their expendable income, you're motivated to spend your money in places where you feel comfortable, where the content is trusted and going to be good. And so I think that that's also driving interest and spend in franchises and IP. And just one example we heard coming out of Black Friday from one of our major retail partners, the number one product that they sold was Twilight. And I think that is an example of a testament to the sustainability and endurance of a high quality film franchise.
Yeah, I'm sure that now that we do have that ability to find different IP, different franchises, and anytime we want, not necessarily just when it opens or whatever. There are some surprises, you suddenly find that something is popping that, may have seemed to be, off the landscape for a couple of years or whatever. So that's pretty interesting stuff. Sandra, I'm going to circle back to you again to sort of address this when it comes to streaming and how these franchises possibly help develop these new streaming entities that we're all seeing, or just what that role is.
There was an interesting statistic some time ago, a couple of years ago, about how audiences were using streaming platforms, what they were gravitating towards, what their favorite shows were. And we saw over and over again, the statistics bore out that the shows that people were watching were The Office, Friends, shows with Seinfeld 25 years later, shows with which they had established a connection at a time in the past and continued with that connection, continued that love of those characters, has continued and been passed down to subsequent generations. And so everybody, all of the streaming platforms particularly, are looking to find ways to establish, to develop connections with audiences and keep those audiences. The big concern for all streamers, for all paid platforms, is churn. People sign up. I think we've all done it. I'm lazy, so I don't churn as much as others. But there's something we must watch. We sign up for a platform, we've seen it, we tune out. So the streamers, particularly the pay services, are looking for ways not only to draw in subscribers but to retain subscribers. And the a reliable way to retain subscribers is to keep them connected to things that they know and that they love.
Sure.
Platforms, I come again to the Power franchise because it was designed, of course, these were shows that we loved, these were characters we loved, these are very high quality productions, but we have a very rabid and committed fan base who want to continue to see these characters. And we know that we can retain them by giving them the programming that they will show up to watch. I think for streamers particularly, that is a really major objective.
Right. Yeah. It as we've seen that people have signed up for certain services. Something's coming. There's a lot of movies going to be on this streaming service. Sign up for that and then drop off again. It sounds like these franchises keep you interested. Oh, what's going to be next? I should stay with this because something else. There's always going to be something new that I'm have an attraction to. I've already been on with. Yeah, yeah. I wanted to circle back to you, Erin, on this one. One of the things I think we worry about perhaps is, gosh, where is the place for those new ideas? Where is a place for those kind of, the movies we all, that the finance people love to write about that, hey, it was just a mid-priced film and all of a sudden, it's doing 100 million. How do we think about those sort of one-offs, if you will? Those
the movies our children will remake. Yeah, we
right.
we feel very, very aware that almost all of our franchises began as movies that were just a one-off mid-range movie. We did not release the first John Wick and call it John Wick 1 because we had no awareness and would be kidding ourselves if we said that we did, that the movie would become the thing that it became. You go into it knowing that you're telling a story about a character who you hope the audience will love as much as we loved. And you go into it knowing that there is way more story that can be told, but an audience has to show up and then tell you that they want more of that character. Same thing with Now You See Me. We're going to go make a third one of that, but never in a million years did we have some expectation that thing would breed multiple movies afterwards, a reality series. And so we owe it to ourselves to continue to be finding those stories that deserve to be told at what we consider the mid-range budget. And the thing, we're a very, very small company. We do not have mounds and mounds of IP. We feel lucky to have birthed the franchises that we have internally, and those lives getting extended and that security of those IP franchise money coming in then does allow us to take what we will call a little bit of risk on telling some new stories. And we do have a bunch in the hopper and a bunch that we're going to go off and make next week or next year. So it's a lane that we will continue to protect and continue to be very, very proud to be a part of.
Sure. So yes, as you say, we didn't go into this with the John Wick verse in mind. So that's terrific. Yeah, and again, I think audiences do probably appreciate that sort of feeling of, spontaneity. Hey, I'm part of something that I saw this great movie, and it's fresh, it's new, it's something that do you think franchises, is there a point at which they lose that? Do they need to be?
I mean, I think that audiences really do demand great quality, and they have shown that they don't settle for IP for the sake of IP. And I think that many people have tried that. You still have to deliver a product that warrants their $14, and they've become savvier sites like Rotten Tomatoes are things that used to be second thoughts for people, but now I think participate in their decision-making process.
Nice.
Reviews do. I think the Twitterverse does. I think they start to weigh reviews as part of their decision to go. And so we take that seriously. And that means that we really, really do have to deliver. So yeah, I do think that you could take a franchise down by handling it without care and handling it without humility.
Yeah. Too many, too fast, or whatever it is. It's definitely a thing to be thought of as you go along. Pamela, we had an opportunity to talk about this a little bit before this discussion. You had some thoughts about this whole issue when it comes to diversity and diverse characters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's such an incredible opportunity for those mid-budget movies to be thinking about how we're telling fresh, different stories that not only have, diverse characters in them, but also come from a different crew of storytellers. I think even when you think about like what we're able to unlock when you're able to have start to empower some of the historically excluded communities who haven't been able to make their Wick or their Hunger Games yet. All of those franchise starters are going to begin at those mid-budget levels with those original fresh ideas. And I think a big part of our team's credo is that unlocking opportunities for underrepresented filmmakers is good for the business because it's going to usher in new stories that we haven't seen yet. It's going to take familiar stories and make them feel fresh. Audiences of all backgrounds, and we do a lot of research to ground ourselves in the data. And audiences, constantly say that what they want is fresh, new, original content. And what we also hear is that it's not just women, it's not just audiences of color, it's not just queer audiences or disabled audiences that want to see those people in movies. It's all audiences. We regularly see high percentages of white audiences who say, I really want to see content that has people of color at the center of it, behind the camera. And I think that Hollywood continuing to invest in that quote unquote mid-budget range, that's where the gate opening is going to come from. And that's where the next generation of, to Erin's point of like, what are the movies that our kids are going to be remaking? We're still in the phase of like rebooting or remaking franchises or IP that maybe wasn't initially super diverse and infusing it with sort of where we are now. I think the next step forward, the real leap, is going to be when we start to build organically authentic, diverse franchises from the start, which, Lionsgate has been really starting to invest in with certain books that we're acquiring, certain stories that we're starting to tell, just making the first draft diverse and inclusive versus something that we're going to circle back to and improve in a second, third, and fourth. And so I think we have to continue to invest in those stories. And we're seeing audiences say they want to see those stories too.
Right. That it's not just we want to see reflected on the screen exactly the demographics of the population, but kind of what's new. What haven't we seen before?
That's exactly right. Like content is a portal into worlds that you don't exist in. And that can be true in a very science fiction way of like, I'm going to a different planet or I'm seeing a different species. It can also be true in a very literal sense of like, I know my experience as a Black woman. I don't know what the experience might be of a South Asian queer person in this part of the country. Content is our portal to empathy and seeing other people. And what we generally tend to find is behind the specificity is universality. But that means that leading with that specificity can really engage a lot of different audiences who are curious and interested and want a different perspective. That's how we're going to get to know one another.
Sure. Yeah. Very important to just our perception of what's normal in this world.
Absolutely.
One of the examples that like is probably a perfect example of the thing that both Kamala and I are talking about is a movie that we just wrapped currently right now called Shadow Force, which was an incredible action script that we read that was about a couple who had met inside a spy organization, but when they fell in love and got pregnant, they escaped, but not without a lot of enemies. And in order to keep their young son safe, they separated. He stayed and raised the son while she stayed and hovered nearby to ensure that they were always safe. And we built that movie as a starring vehicle for 2 Black actors. We ended up with Kerry Washington and Omar Sy. And the thing that happens is the script was always just a beautiful love story on wheels a little bit, as this family then at the beginning of the movie, they are discovered, they come back together and have to go on the run in order to like save their little family. And there's relationship banter along the way. But it put at the center of an action movie a Black love story, and it put at the center of the stakes. Normally you put little blonde girls as the big stake, as like the central stakes for a movie like that. And for the first time ever, we're going to see a little Black boy. And that is profound. And yet most people will just experience the movie as a really killer action movie and not think twice about it. But for a big population of the audience, it will be really, really meaningful. And the first time they've actually seen that done.
Right. And meaningful, even if you aren't, as you say, some people will be specifically aware of it, some people will not, but it changes the game.
And you'll just know that it feels different.
Yeah, hey, this feels different. I haven't felt this way before. It's always a good way to feel.
And while we're not releasing it as Shadow Force 1, our hope is.
Exactly.
we won't hold you to it. Now, I'm spinning, to a little bit of a different topic, but it's such an interesting one. From Jennifer, we talk about how all of this helps audiences engage, helps them connect, whether it's a franchise, whether it's something fresh, whether it's something new. But then people are engaging with the content in so many different ways these days that are not necessarily just about watching the film, but they want to be creating, their own work based on it. It's just very interesting to me that that's what's happening. Cosplay, all those things. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so from our perspective, right, every new platform, app, experience format presents a new opportunity to reach our fans and also reach new fans. And as a content creator, we really want to engage and deliver our content to our fans in as many authentic ways as possible. And so, when you talk about cosplay and immersive experiences, there are so many levels within fandom of the depth of how people want to engage with the IP. And I think it's our job to kind of meet all of those levels and sort of, I often say I wish I had a crystal ball and could look into the future, but we have to be really aware of where the fan community is going and how they're engaging. And, the metaverse and Web3, of course, is a big topic of conversation. I don't think I can go a day without someone asking me about it. Right. And the reason that us in the IP world are so excited about that space is because it gives us this direct connection to fans that we really haven't had. Right now we communicate, with our fans through social media. And that's really like the primary way that we get feedback. When we create experiences, on the blockchain or with Web3 or in the metaverse, like all of a sudden we have that direct communication line with them. And I think it also gives us an opportunity to build communities around our content and help fans build those communities with us. And that's a really exciting thing. I often say that when we're extending our IP out into the world, we want to make that world bigger and smaller at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a little bit of a head scratcher. But if you think about it, we want as many people to engage with it as possible, but we want to make it feel small enough that it feels personal to you, right? That experience that you're having, you're really connecting with, and you're able to engage in the way that you want. And when we think about where we're heading with Web3, I mean, we're all online, I think the latest study I saw is 8 hours a day. And we're operating in a system that is decades old and is ready for an overhaul. And so I think about being able to play, shop, be entertained, have experiences, socialize, create, and even run a business. I think, as you were alluding to, with the great creator economy within a virtual world, but have that world be centered around our IP. I mean, that's a tremendous opportunity for us and for fans. Mm-hmm. And so we've been collaborating with a number of leaders in that space. We've partnered with Fortnite. We have really exciting partnerships with Autograph and the Sandbox. And we're working on some other innovative experiences we haven't even announced yet that I'm just really excited about, because I think they're going to be next level in terms of how fans will be able to not only interact with and within our IP, but maybe co-create with us. And so, it is really possible now for fans to work with us to create, digital products and experiences in a way where we can monetize alongside each other. And, I think that new frontier is, and the promise of what it will bring is really great for all, right? So,
right, yeah. No, it's a great thing to think that someone out there might, I don't know, create their own Wakanda Forever jewelry without getting sued. That in other words, it could be a partnership that they could, work together.
I think that's right. We spend, a lot of time thinking about, how do you enforce this and but if we took that time and energy and thought about how do we foster it in a way that's authentic and supported by us, there's a lot of great opportunity in that. And we've done partnerships with fans. We often, we're always looking for insight from our fans. What are they creating? Whether it's fan fiction or fan art, or products that maybe we haven't put out into the market that they're envisioning, because that's giving us, great perspective as to where we should be heading and where we need to be for our fans. And we have sometimes partnered with fans when we found really incredible things and made it official. So, why not be proactive on that front? I think it's a whole new way of looking at things.
One other way of connecting. Is it exclusive to the younger generation? Are they the ones who are seeing new products in this way, or is it across the board? Are you seeing, maybe an older generation of moviegoers, television watchers engaging them this way?
I think it's actually far broader than people imagine. And I say that because it's certainly happening with younger audiences. And when you think about Roblox and, Fortnite and Minecraft, that it certainly has strong appeal for younger audiences. But when you look at the audiences that are operating on the blockchain, many of them are in their 30s, right? So they're adults.
Right.
And I think, it is a broader range of people, especially for those that have grown up kind of with devices, with the internet being such a big part of our lives, and sort of with this notion of being able to kind of create and play in worlds and spaces that maybe you didn't have that opportunity before. And I think there are now decades of people that have kind of come up that way and want to play and experience and engage as creatively as possible. And so I would say, Diane, it's actually a broader audience than you would think. And yeah, if you walk into Disneyland, on any day, you will see people of all ages finding ways to cosplay and creating their own, opportunities to engage with an IP.
Yeah, kind of gives that older generation, you're not a nerd if you do this. This is becoming one of the ways to interact and connect. It's not just for kids. It's kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah.
And to some of these younger generations discovering older IP like Friends or The Office or whatever. Hey, did you my stepson once said, I'm watching this Seinfeld thing, like, have you heard of it? It'd be interesting to see how they develop these connections, how they become the fans, and do they want to add this level of interaction that perhaps the generation that started with those shows didn't have. Well, I do want to, we have addressed this a little bit, but I wanted to hear a little bit more from Kamala about the idea that just sort of the fine, and again, some of these products and other ways of connecting may be part of it. We've seen the huge popularity of Black Panther and Wakanda Forever, and there's money in it, let's put it that way, to seeing yourself reflected on screen. I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on that, and I've had other through interviews that this is not about fairness or just leveling the playing field, anything like that. It's just, this is where the money is in a lot of ways.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think I constantly repeat that this is not a social justice enterprise. Mm-hmm. Like, yes, of course, there are real reasons why we need to be thinking about, what some of the social impact of this work is. But at the end of the day, if you are just approaching this as purely a capitalist, it is in your best interest to make content that is relevant to the people who are the cultural carriers of our generation. And we see just the American audience landscape has shifted significantly. And it's not a coincidence that movies like Black Panther and Crazy Rich Asians and Girls Trip and Straight Outta Compton and, you know, Encanto, like, and we can keep going, right? You know, those are the audiences that have been over consumers of entertainment for a long time. And what we're seeing is that, you know, in many ways, Black audiences can be that sort of harbinger of sort of how to think about diversity and what audiences are demanding, because, you know, Black people have been, you know, a little bit more represented in content than some of the other underrepresented groups. And so the conversations amongst Black audiences are kind of in a little bit of a different place than maybe some of the other conversations amongst Latina audiences or API audiences or Indigenous audiences. But what I think really knits them all together is that at the end of the day, how amazing is it that we can have Wakanda Forever and Till, and we're making Shadow Force, and we just acquired The Blackening. Like, what it really shows is that, you know, this idea of a Black movie, like, Black is not a genre.
Right. For sure.
Black audiences don't consume Black content, right? We consume content that speaks to us in different ways. And that's how the rest of the audience consumes as well. And so really being thoughtful about how are we putting out there multi-dimensional stories with different genres, with different types of people, because that's where the unfound money in Hollywood is. Like, we can point back to the McKinsey study, elevating that, hey, there's $10 billion worth of economic opportunity for the content industry and more equitably including Black creatives in front of and behind the camera. And so I think it's important for us to remember kind of there is an undeniable feeling that audiences feel when they see themselves represented. We saw the social fervor around even the release of the Little Mermaid trailer. But as many of us like saw those videos of young Black girls looking at that trailer and that reveal in the end and like getting so excited, and older Black people saying like, I never would have thought I'd see the day. There are also other audiences that are getting such valuable things from that type of content, because all of a sudden it's like audiences of color who have always had to be able to see themselves in maybe characters that didn't look like them. Like, I'm a Sex and the City fan. I was like, I'm a Carrie. It didn't deter me from being like, I'm a Carrie because she's a white blonde lady who at the time was much older than me. But other audiences haven't necessarily had to do that. And it is such a empathy creating, humanizing experience to see yourself in a character that maybe doesn't look like you, at the same time taking advantage of just that growing content appetite, as we see again and again that Latina audiences over index when it comes to theatrical, when we see that we're already at a point for younger audiences where we are more than 50% non-white. So there's catching up to do, and in that catching up comes obvious consumer and economic opportunity, because whatever product you're making, whether it is Coke or movies or handbags, you're constantly doing audience research to understand who is my consumer and how do I speak to them. And here's a place where I feel like we have a little bit of a cheat code. We see where the audience is and where it's going. And if we can keep up with them, we're going to continue to make things that are relevant. And for movies, I think, and movies and television, it is so important. Culture, content has such a big place in our culture, but I don't think it's guaranteed, right? There are other things that are taking audience attention. There's gaming, there's social media. And so in order to stay relevant as the sort of capital C content and to have that, capital I impact on culture, we have to continue to make content that feels relevant to the audiences that are actually consuming.
Yeah, and as Jen was talking about a little bit, that if even if it's something like a creative product that's inspired by a film, the fact that you see a lot of different people wearing it
absolutely
means, hey, that maybe that's for me.
Yeah,
you don't have to be skinny, white, and young for this.
Yes,
something.
Yes.
Like that.
We talk so much about that. I mean, what you just said made me think of, one of the things we talk about here is like being really vigilant around white as neutral in our storytelling. Oftentimes when we read a script because it's on the page, we are picturing the characters who have always been the characters.
Sure.
This is the lead, and like, what does a lead look like? What does a heroine look like? Who's the villain? And like really asking ourselves those questions for
Right.
like, okay, I didn't think about that, but can't it be
Why
a
not?
queer like assassin? Like, why can't queer people be assassins? They do things besides come out, right? It's not
Right.
like, and
It doesn't have to be the coming out story.
right? It's like, so how do we challenge ourselves to find all those interesting cultural storytelling opportunities that are going to make it fresher?
I would tack on to that too, that like you do have to find a story that's worthy of being told. There are like these extraordinary experiences that are super, super specific to somebody. And you know, you learn in film school as a storyteller that like the more specific you give an example of, the broader the entry point, which always sounds so counterintuitive. But the film school example is My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where none of us probably had fathers who used Windex as a medicinal, you know, force, but it was something that was like so specific, and it allowed us all to feel seen because we all have parents that do weird things that maybe we're embarrassed of. And then even more specific, like those people who are children of immigrants felt super seen by that movie, right? And so like one of the movies that Kamal and I are most excited about for next year is a movie that that we made with 3 Asian American women who really did just want to tell a story about 3 girls going on a trip that was raunchy, and they had control of their sexual identities, and they had the time of their lives, and they weren't model minorities, and they weren't, you know, and it's just a girls trip. But up at the center of it is a movie about identity, because the trip is launched by one of the characters who was adopted by white parents wanting to go to China to meet her birth parents. And while that's, I did not experience that, but the journey of identity and owning your identity is something that I can relate to, right? So at the end of the day, it's going to be a movie that just like makes everybody laugh, but it was a story really, really worth telling because of that specificity. And you were only going to find that by telling it through the lens of like 3 Asian women.
Right. Yeah. A different lens.
Yeah, but just I want to amplify on something that Kamala said, because it was so interesting to me when you said Black is not a genre. What we have found in TV, is that if you tell a universal story, audiences show up. White audiences will show up for programming about Black characters if they can respond to those characters and see themselves. They may not look like those characters, but can see themselves in the things that they experience, or things for which they have empathy, even if they haven't experienced.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In that programming. So we find in our Power franchise, for instance, although most of those series have Black characters at their center, the audience is fairly well divided between Black and white viewers. We find that in Force, where the one Power series that has at its center a white character, again, as many Black folks show up as white because they like the characters, they respond to the character, they see universal issues. Despite the fact that he is white, he is the other.
Yeah. I think everybody
Respond to that.
one way or another, right? We all do.
Yeah.
And so
That's exactly right. People respond
speaking
regardless of the basic premise of the story. Right?
Well, Sandra and the rest of you, I want to just, had a great discussion, and before we run out of time here, I did want to, speaking of being the other or diversity, you're all women in Hollywood, so in the seat of power there. A lot of people, I'm sure, who are watching this are envious and curious and how you got there. I'm wondering, has your being a woman in Hollywood Are we over it? Are we past that? Has it been a particular challenge? Has it? Where are we with that issue? Maybe you can speak to, and I'll just kind of throw that out to anybody who'd like to respond as kind of our last question.
We certainly are not past it.
Okay.
We are better represented than we had been, but it is still a struggle to be included in the room. I think, just speaking from my own experience, because I've been doing this a really long time, it required much greater fearlessness, much greater persistence to bang down those doors, to knock on those doors, and to get included. We had to, at least again in my experience, demand inclusion. It didn't just happen.
That's
right? And still need to, make a greater effort. It is not effortless to be heard, to be valued, to be included.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that?
Go ahead. I was just going to build on what Sandra said, because, when people ask me, what it's like to be a woman working in entertainment, or just a woman working in a corporate world in general, I think, to Sandra's point, like, we have to work so much harder to be seen and heard. And I always give the advice to women, and I try to follow it myself, which is really focus on building your brand identity, like who you are, and then making sure that it's visible. And today is a perfect example, right? Like, doing panels like this is a lot of work, and it's extra work on top of our jobs. But we all wanted to do it, and we were all excited about it because I think it's really important to pushing women forward. Like, so the more of us that can take these opportunities and seize them and speak out and represent, I think, is incredibly important. So it's always sort of forcing yourself to put yourself out there. If there is a seat at the table, take it. When you walk into that room, it can be intimidating sometimes when it is all white men sitting around a table, and don't take the seat at the corner or not at the table, take it. And I think that once you've achieved that level of kind of having a place of being seen and heard, the next step is, how do you use that voice you have to amplify the voices of others? I think that's imperative as well.
Somebody said the other day, I can't remember who, but I'm taking this as my own. And she said, if there is no seat at the table, bring a chair.
Shirley Chisholm.
Oh, is it Shirley Chisholm? Yeah. And I thought that was just
even better.
I was gonna say, I totally agree. Like, we're certainly not past it. I think, like, we see it every day. I think that, we know, even if you are not a statistician, that when you're walking through the various rooms, as you get into the more and more senior rooms, you're seeing less and less women. And then when you compound that as a woman of color, it can be quite stark. I consider myself really lucky and privileged to be able to be a person that other people can look at and say, oh, it's possible. And so I think that principle that is talked about as in terms of rise up and reach back, we have to do both. We have to continue to open additional doors. And I think in some ways, the kind of first generation of women executives, because there were so few, there was a box that they felt like they had to be in, where it was like, I'm just lucky to be here, so I'm just going to act like the male leaders and hope that they don't notice that I'm a woman, right? I think that we're now on the precipice of women leaders, female leaders, that feel like they can actually genuinely take up space. They can lead in a different way, because the way I think about it is that because there are still so few women of color, for instance, in my case, so very few women of color in senior rooms getting a chance to touch content, input on decisions. There's no point in me being there if I'm working on trying to be just like everybody else in the room. You're not actually getting the benefit of the perspective that I'm bringing, because I'm trying to be like the people who have always been in the seat, then I may as well not come. So if I'm sitting in the seat, I need to actually make sure that that is a uniquely occupied seat that brings a different perspective that then allows other people to see that there are different ways to lead. There are different models of leadership. Like if you Google CEO, you're probably still going to get a lot of pictures of white men. That's really important to shift and change and be thinking, when I think director, why am I thinking man? When I'm thinking manager, why am I thinking man? And like, we have to be in those seats to push those things so that the mental markers, the visual representation of what a president of production or a vice chairman of a studio or, you know, a head of this team, we start to think, oh, that could be this incredible woman as well. Let me mentor some of the people that are out in the, you know, out in the cubicles,
Right.
so they can fill those seats one day.
Yeah,
I feel compelled to add on to a thing that she said because it was a turning point for me early on, which is that, like, as a young woman coming up in this industry, I did not see behavior modeled that was ever going to look anything like what I was capable of doing as a leader.
Mhm.
Like, you know, to use Kamala's terms, like it was masculinity as neutral, like overt confidence in one's own opinion, a lack of emotion, you know, like these masculine qualities are what all of my bosses emulated. And then it even went so far as like, it made me feel like my feminine qualities were weaknesses rather than the thing that I actually learned over time and the thing that happened when I leaned into them, when I leaned into the fact that I am an emotional and warm human being, when I leaned into the fact that I listen before I have an opinion. Like all of those things have actually made me a much better leader. And had I listened to the insecurity I had around my femininity, and had I tried to emulate that masculinity, like I would have failed.
Right. It really can be a superpower. And I'm going to have to sort of stop us here just because we're running out of time. We could do this for 3 more hours and I'd have a great time. But I did want to thank you all so much for being here. I hope that next year we'll have the Women of Lionsgate 2, because I think it'd make a great sequel. I want to thank our listeners and our viewers for tuning in, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of our Power Women Summit. We've got some great people out there and some great topics that we'll be covering. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Diane.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.